My fiance's sister tried to recreate our wedding album with her new boyfriend, so I exposed her fake life at family dinner. I knew my fiance's family viewed me as an outsider, but I was willing to prove them wrong. I spent years supporting his dreams, believing that love and hard work could bridge any gap. I thought the only enemy we had was the financial stress that was slowly suffocating us. I was wrong. The real threat wasn't debt or bad luck. It was his sister, Veronica. She lived a life of curated perfection that I never could compete with, and she made sure everyone knew it. I didn't care about her designer bags or her Instagram-worthy vacations. I cared about my relationship, and I was determined to make it work. But when my fiance's latest business venture crashed and burned, I found myself holding the smoking gun. The evidence I uncovered didn't just show me what was wrong with the company, it revealed the true, manipulative nature of the person who was trying to destroy everything I love. The first time I met my fiance's family, I felt like a stranger walking into a play where I hadn't been given a script. They were loud, boisterous, and constantly finishing each other's sentences, a whirlwind of shared history and inside jokes that I could only observe from the periphery. I was raised in a quieter household, where love was expressed through actions rather than words, through prepared meals and steadfast support. His family, on the other hand, used words like weapons, sometimes playful, other times sharp and pointed. I quickly learned that I was the only one who seemed to notice the edge in his sister's voice. Veronica was 3 years older than my fiancé, Daniel, and she wielded her seniority like a scepter. From the moment we were introduced, she had a way of looking at me that made me feel like I was being measured against a standard I didn't even know existed. She was the golden child, the one who had married well and lived in a pristine house in the suburbs with her husband, Mark. Mark was a successful architect, a quiet man who seemed to have traded his personality for a well-tailored suit. Veronica's life was a carefully curated museum of success, filled with gleaming appliances, expensive art, and a distinct lack of any actual mess. She often lamented that Daniel had settled by going into business with me instead of pursuing a more lucrative career path. For the first few years of our relationship, I absorbed these comments with a tight smile. I knew my love for Daniel was real, and I was confident in our shared vision for the future. We were building something beautiful together, a small, eco-friendly home goods company called Willow & Wick. It was our baby, a culmination of my marketing background and his passion for sustainable design. We worked out of our cramped apartment, surrounded by boxes of organic soy wax and recycled packaging. It was stressful, and the financial uncertainty gnawed at me during the sleepless nights, but we were united. We had a plan. We were happy. The problem started about a year ago. It began subtly, with Veronica's newfound interest in our business. It was surprising, really. She had always dismissed it as a little hobby, and made snide remarks about how we wouldn't be able to afford her lifestyle. But suddenly she was full of advice. It started with casual comments at family dinners, suggesting we expand our product line or try a different supplier. Then she offered to help manage our social media, claiming she had experience and a large network. Daniel, desperate for any boost and still seeking his family's approval, was overjoyed. "See," he'd say, "she's finally coming around." I tried to share his optimism, but a knot of apprehension twisted in my stomach. Veronica's help was always laced with a subtle condescension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that her interest wasn't entirely altruistic. The first sign of real trouble came when Daniel decided to take a major financial risk. He had an idea for a new line of luxury, limited edition candles, crafted with rare, ethically sourced ingredients. The problem was that the initial investment was enormous. We would have to drain our personal savings and take on a significant bank loan. I was hesitant. The numbers were daunting and the margins felt too thin. During one of our late-night strategy sessions at our cluttered kitchen table, I tried to voice my concerns. "Daniel, this feels like a leap of faith we can't afford to take," I said, sliding a spreadsheet of our monthly expenses across the table. "If this doesn't sell as well as we hope, we're sunk." Veronica had been visiting that evening, sipping a glass of wine and feigning interest in our discussion. She leaned over to look at the spreadsheet, her long, manicured fingers tapping the table. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice dripping with a false sweetness that made my skin crawl. "That's the problem with small thinkers. You have to bet big to win big." She turned to Daniel, her eyes wide with a performative sincerity. "Don't you see, brother? This is your moment. This is how you build the future you deserve. You can't let fear hold you back." She then, in a gesture that I found shockingly inappropriate, offered to guarantee part of the loan with her own savings. "Family supports family," she declared. I wanted to scream. I wanted to point out that she was pressuring him, not supporting him. I knew that if Daniel failed, Veronica would be fine. She had Mark's cushion to fall back on. We didn't have that luxury, but he was so moved by her sudden support and validation that my objections seemed petty in comparison. "See, my sister believes in me," he said, completely blind to the manipulation. This is what I need. Let's do it. Against my better judgment, and because I loved him and wanted to support his dream, I agreed. We took out the loan, poured our savings into it, and doubled down on our work. The next 6 months were a blur of late nights, frantic research, and a relentless push to meet our production deadlines. Daniel spent most of his time coordinating with overseas suppliers, while I handled all the marketing, the packaging design, and even the graphic design for the launch campaign. It was exhausting but exhilarating. We were so close, but the launch was a disaster. The sales were abysmal. The luxury market was saturated, and our brand, while beloved by our core audience, didn't have the prestige to compete. We had produced thousands of units that were now sitting in a storage unit, gathering dust. Our expenses were astronomical, and with no revenue coming in, the reality of our situation hit us like a freight train. We were facing bankruptcy. The tension in our relationship was palpable. Daniel became sullen and withdrawn, snapping at me for the smallest things. He avoided talking about the business, retreating into a cocoon of denial. When his family came over, the atmosphere was even worse. Daniel, in an attempt to deflect his own feelings of failure, had started to subtly place the blame on me. Maybe if the branding had been different, he'd mutter, or my sister said she would have gone with a different vendor. His parents, who had always been kind but distant, began to look at me with a new wariness. I could hear their hushed conversations in the kitchen. She was the one handling the marketing, his mother would say, her voice a low murmur. If only they'd listened to Veronica. It all came to a head on a Sunday afternoon. Veronica and Mark had come over for dinner, and the atmosphere was thick with unspoken accusations. Daniel and his father were looking over the financial statements in the living room, while Veronica cornered me in the kitchen. You know, she said, holding a glass of water and inspecting my modest kitchen with a disdainful eye. Daniel is a dreamer. He always has been. He needs a keeper, someone to make sure he doesn't lose his way. Her implication was clear. I was the one who had led him astray. I was the reason for his failure. I was the bad influence. As I stood there, holding a tray of appetizers, feeling the heat of her gaze and the weight of their entire family's judgment, something in me snapped. The adrenaline of the past few months, the frustration, and the sheer injustice of it all coalesced into a single burning thought. I have the evidence. The nagging feeling I had for a year, the strange pattern of failed contacts and bad advice, finally had a source. I had found the emails, the old forgotten files, but I needed to be sure. I excused myself, muttering about a headache and retreating to our cramped bedroom. I opened my laptop, my hands shaking, and pulled up the encrypted file I had discovered just that morning. It was a series of documents and correspondence. It wasn't just an accounting of our failure, it was a blueprint for it. And it was addressed from a mysterious burner email, a source I had finally traced back to her. The truth was finally clear, and it was more devastating than I could have imagined. The screen glowed in the dim light of our bedroom, illuminating the evidence I had been too afraid to confront. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the documents, each one a piece of a puzzle I hadn't even known I was solving. There, buried in a folder labeled Supplier Correspondence, were emails sent from a burner account to our competitors, offering them insights into our upcoming product launches. There were messages to our raw material supplier, instructing them to delay shipments and inflate prices. And there at the bottom was the smoking gun, a detailed financial projection that predicted our failure with chilling accuracy, followed by a note that read, "Daniel will need a lifeline. Be ready to offer it." The handwriting on that last note was unmistakably Veronica's. I recognized the looping, dramatic flourishes she used in family birthday cards. The betrayal was so calculated, so cold, that I felt physically ill. She hadn't just been unsupportive. She had actively sabotaged us. She had orchestrated our failure to make herself look like the savior, the one who would step in and rescue her poor, misguided brother from his foolish choices. She wanted him to be indebted to her, to need her. She wanted to prove that his life was better when she was in control. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the screen, trying to process what I had discovered. The smell of the appetizers I had been carrying wafted in from the kitchen, making my stomach churn. I could hear the muffled sounds of Daniel and his father arguing in the living room, their voices rising and falling in a familiar rhythm of blame and denial. My first instinct was to storm out there, to brandish my laptop and expose Veronica for the manipulative snake she was. I imagined the look on her face when her perfect facade crumbled, the shock in Mark's quiet eyes, the devastation in Daniel's. It would feel so good, but then I paused. I thought about Daniel. He was proud, fragile, and desperate for his family's approval. He had spent his entire life trying to measure up to Veronica's impossible standards. If I burst in there with accusations, he would be forced to choose between me and his family. And despite everything, despite the evidence, I wasn't sure he would choose me. He had been conditioned to believe in Veronica's superiority, to trust her judgment over his own. He would need time to see the truth for himself. I needed a better plan. I closed the laptop and took a deep, steadying breath. When I returned to the living room, I was calm. My face was a mask of practiced neutrality. The appetizers were cold by now, but I set them down anyway, offering a weak smile. Veronica was still holding court in the kitchen, her voice a low, conspiratorial murmur that stopped the moment I walked in. She looked at me with those sharp, assessing eyes, and I met her gaze without flinching. I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face, a tiny crack in her armor. She knew I had been in the bedroom for a long time. She suspected something. Dinner was a torturous affair. Daniel and his father were still locked in their tense discussion about the business, and his mother kept shooting me sympathetic glances that felt more accusatory than comforting. Veronica, however, was in her element. She dominated the conversation, steering it toward her own successes. She talked about Mark's new promotion, about a vacation they were planning to the Amalfi Coast, about a gallery opening she was helping to organize. She was performing, demonstrating her superiority with every mundane detail. "Oh, Daniel," she said, leaning back in her chair with a satisfied sigh. "I was speaking to a friend of mine who runs a venture capital firm. He said that if you ever want to pivot, he might be able to help. We could talk about it, just the two of us sometime." I watched Daniel's face light up with a desperate hope. "Really?" he asked, leaning forward. "That would be incredible. We could turn this around." I saw it then, the trap that was about to spring. Veronica was positioning herself as his only hope, the one person who could save him. She would offer him a loan or a partnership with strings attached. She would take over our business, strip away everything we had built, and leave me with nothing. She would push me out, and Daniel would be grateful to her for it. The thought made my blood boil. "I think that's a wonderful idea," I said, my voice dripping with a sweetness that tasted like poison on my tongue. I turned to Veronica, offering her a bright, genuine-looking smile. "Daniel has been so lost lately. He really needs someone he can trust to guide him. Please do help him. We would be so grateful." Veronica blinked, clearly taken aback by my sudden approval. She had expected resistance, a fight. She had wanted me to object so she could paint me as the jealous, controlling girlfriend. My acquiescence disarmed her. She recovered quickly, flashing a triumphant smile. "Of course," she said. "That's what family is for." I felt Daniel's hand squeeze mine under the table, a gesture of relief and gratitude. He thought I was finally coming around, finally accepting his sister's help. He had no idea what I was actually doing. I was playing along. I was buying myself time. I needed to understand the full scope of her manipulation, to gather even more evidence, and to find the best way to expose her without destroying Daniel in the process. Over the next few days, I became a detective in my own life. While Daniel spent hours on the phone with Veronica and her venture capitalist friend, I combed through our digital records with forensic precision. I cross-referenced dates, tracked IP addresses, and discovered she had also been in contact with our web developer, instructing them to accidentally delete our customer database just before the launch. It was a miracle I had a backup. She had been playing a long game, a masterclass in familial sabotage, all while smiling at me and calling me honey. The most damning piece of evidence came in the form of a text message exchange she had with Mark. It had been backed up on an old laptop I had borrowed for a project, a laptop she had asked to use months ago. I found the folder by accident. A careless error on her part. The messages were chilling. She had told Mark he needs to hit rock bottom before he realizes I'm the only one who truly cares. She's just a distraction, a phase. Once he loses everything, he'll come crawling back to us. I printed everything. I organized it into a neat, clear file, complete with timestamps and explanations. I was no longer just a victim of her schemes. I was an investigator armed with irrefutable truth. But the question remained: how and when to strike. A public confrontation would feel satisfying, but it would also be chaotic. I needed to be strategic. I needed to control the narrative. I decided to wait for the perfect moment, the one where she would be most vulnerable, most unprepared for the truth. That moment came sooner than I expected. A week later, Veronica threw a lavish dinner party at her home to celebrate Mark's promotion. It was a grand affair, the kind of event she lived for, a chance to parade her perfect life in front of her friends and family. I was not looking forward to it. I knew I would have to smile and make small talk with people who saw me as Daniel's underachieving girlfriend, the one who had dragged him down. But as I got ready, slipping into the only decent dress I owned, I knew this was my opportunity. I tucked the file into my large handbag, my heart hammering against my ribs. Tonight, I would set the record straight. I would not let her destroy the life I had worked so hard to build. The stage was set. The audience was waiting. And the leading lady, my dear sister-in-law, had no idea she was about to be the star of a very different kind of show. The drive to Veronica's house felt surreal, like I was hurtling toward a collision I had been anticipating for months. Daniel sat beside me in the passenger seat, oblivious to the storm brewing inside my head. He was dressed in his best suit, the one he wore for client meetings, and he kept adjusting his tie nervously. He was excited. He had been meeting with Veronica's venture capitalist contact, a man named Richard, and he believed a deal was imminent. He thought his sister was about to save him. I knew she was about to bury him. Her house was even more impressive than I remembered. The manicured lawn glowed under perfectly placed landscape lighting, and the sprawling modern mansion was a monument to everything she valued: status, appearance, and control. As we walked up the flagstone path, I could hear the low murmur of conversation and the clinking of glasses from inside. The scent of expensive perfume and gourmet food wafted through the air. It was a world I had never belonged to, and tonight, I was about to shatter its illusion. Veronica greeted us at the door, resplendent in a silk gown that probably cost more than our monthly rent. She air-kissed Daniel's cheek and gave me a brief, dismissive hug that was more performance than affection. "So glad you could make it," she said, her eyes scanning my outfit with barely concealed disdain. "You look nice." The pause before the word nice was a dagger wrapped in velvet. The evening progressed as these events always did. We mingled with strangers who asked polite questions about our business and then quickly lost interest when they realized we weren't successful. Daniel kept glancing toward the door, waiting for Richard to arrive. I kept my handbag close, feeling the weight of the file inside like a physical anchor. Mark was his usual quiet self, refilling drinks and nodding along to conversations he wasn't participating in. His parents were there too, his mother fussing over the floral arrangements, and his father engaged in a heated discussion about golf with another guest. And then Richard arrived. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a handshake that felt like a power play. Veronica immediately steered Daniel toward him, positioning herself between them like a conductor orchestrating a performance. I watched them from across the room, sipping a glass of water I had no intention of finishing. Daniel was nodding enthusiastically, his hands gesturing animatedly. Veronica was smiling, that same triumphant smile she had worn at our apartment. She was feeding him the lines she wanted him to say, guiding the conversation toward her desired outcome. The moment arrived when Veronica excused herself to the kitchen to check on the main course. It was the opening I needed. I followed her, my heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The kitchen was a vast, gleaming space, spotless and impersonal. She was standing by the island, arranging garnishes on a platter, and she looked up in surprise when I entered. "Oh," she said, her tone flat. "Did you need something?" I closed the door behind me and I saw the flicker of unease cross her face. She knew something was wrong. I walked toward her slowly, pulling the file from my handbag. I set it on the island between us, the sound of the thick paper hitting the marble echoing in the silent room. "I found this," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I think you should take a look." Veronica's composure wavered. She glanced at the file, then back at me, a flicker of panic in her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice was higher, more strained. "That's probably just some of Daniel's paperwork." "It's not Daniel's paperwork," I replied, opening the file to the first page. "It's yours. The burner email addresses, the instructions to our suppliers, the sabotage of our website, the projections you sent to yourself predicting our failure. It's all here, Veronica. Every single piece of it." She stared at the documents, her face paling. The confident, condescending mask she always wore had crumbled, revealing something raw and ugly underneath. Her jaw tightened, and I saw her mind racing, searching for an escape route, a lie, anything to protect herself. "That's not what you think it is," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was trying to help. I was trying to teach Daniel a lesson, to make him stronger. He was too reliant on you. He needed to learn to stand on his own." "By destroying his business?" I demanded, my voice rising for the first time. "By bankrupting him? By making him feel like a failure so you could be the one to save him? That's not helping, Veronica. That's control. That's manipulation. You wanted him to need you. You wanted to prove that I was the problem, that he would be better off without me. But the only problem in this family is you." Her eyes hardened. The panic was gone, replaced by something darker. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the island. "You think you've won?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You think anyone is going to believe you? I am Daniel's sister. I have been his protector his entire life. You are just some girl he picked up along the way. Who do you think he's going to choose?" "You're right," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper of my own. "He might not believe me, but he'll believe his own eyes. And that's why I've sent copies of these documents to his parents, to Mark, and to Richard. They're probably all checking their phones right now." The color drained from Veronica's face completely. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She turned toward the door, but it was too late. I heard raised voices from the dining room, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. I opened the kitchen door and stepped aside as Mark burst in, his phone clutched in his hand, his normally expressionless face twisted with fury. "What is this?" he demanded, thrusting the phone toward Veronica. "What have you done?" His parents followed close behind, his mother's face a mask of horror, his father's jaw clenched in anger. Richard was there too, looking deeply uncomfortable. And then Daniel appeared, his face pale, his eyes fixed on me with a mixture of confusion and betrayal. "Tell me this isn't true," he said, his voice cracking. "Tell me she didn't do this." I walked toward him, taking his hands in mine. "I'm so sorry," I said softly. "I know this is devastating, but you have to see the truth. She sabotaged us. She wanted you to fail so she could control you. This was never about helping you. It was about owning you." Daniel looked from me to Veronica, and I saw the realization dawn on his face like a slow sunrise. The denial melted away, replaced by a raw, aching grief. He had spent his entire life seeking his sister's approval, and she had betrayed him in the most profound way possible. He pulled away from me, walking toward Veronica with a heaviness that broke my heart. "How could you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I trusted you. I loved you." Veronica opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, she was speechless. She had orchestrated a masterpiece of manipulation, and in one evening, her entire empire had crumbled to dust. Mark was already walking away from her, his phone still in his hand, his face a stone wall of cold fury. His parents were shaking their heads, their disappointment palpable. Richard had disappeared, presumably to avoid the fallout. I watched as Daniel walked out of the kitchen, his shoulders slumped, his world shattered. I followed him, but not before turning back to Veronica one last time. She was standing alone in that pristine kitchen, surrounded by the ruins of her own making. I didn't feel triumph. I felt only a profound sadness for a woman who had everything and had thrown it all away in a desperate bid for control. In the car on the way home, Daniel didn't speak. He stared out the window, processing the destruction of his family and the betrayal of his sister. I drove in silence, giving him the space he needed. When we finally pulled into our apartment parking lot, he turned to me with red-rimmed eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse, "for showing me the truth. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I reached out and squeezed his hand. "We'll get through this," I said. "We always do." The road ahead would be hard. Our business was in ruins, our finances were a mess, and his family was torn apart. But for the first time in a long time, we were facing it together, without the shadow of Veronica's manipulation hanging over us. We had lost a lot that night, but we had also found something we had been missing: the truth. And in the end, that was worth more than any inheritance, any success, or any validation from a family that had never really accepted me. We started rebuilding from scratch the next day. We found new suppliers, rebuilt our customer base, and slowly, painstakingly, brought Willow and Wick back to life. Daniel never spoke to Veronica again. His parents, shamed by the revelation of their daughter's actions, reached out to us with tentative apologies. We accepted them, but the trust was gone. 2 years later, we finally celebrated the success of our company. It was modest. Nothing like the empire Veronica had built, but it was ours. We had earned it through hard work and resilience, not through manipulation and deceit. Veronica, I heard, had divorced Mark and was living a quieter life in a small town, far from the social circles she had once commanded. I didn't wish her ill, I simply wished her peace. As I looked around our cozy apartment, filled with the scent of our candles and the warmth of our love, I knew I had made the right choice. I had chosen truth over comfort, justice over silence, and in doing so, I had saved not just our business, but our future.